Hello everyone and welcome to Lincoln's Brain Show. I'm your host, Lincoln. And today I'm excited to share with you the fascinating history of the treatment of mental illness. This material has been extremely important to me for a long time. I, as well as many of the people closest to me, have personally benefited from psychiatric and therapeutic care. It's also something that I'd like to pursue as a career someday. I can't think of any way to better utilize the science of psychology than to help those in the most need of psychological care. So let's get into it. I hope you'll enjoy my presentation, and who knows, maybe you'll even learn something too. First, I do need to make a bit of a disclaimer. Despite my undeniably impressive outfit, I am not actually a highly trained, highly qualified expert in all the things I'm going to talk about. And due to the constraints of time and my own meager abilities, I will only be able to touch on some of the main points in the history of mental illness treatment. There's enough material here to fill a hefty stack of books. I'll do what I can, but I won't be able to hit on everything. Part 1. Really old stuff. As long as there have been people, there's been mental illness to some degree. It's every bit as human as physical illness. That means that to get to the roots of mental illness treatment, we have to go all the way back to prehistoric times. Predictably, during these times, science was scarce. People were much less analytical and much more religious. What they did understand, at least in some vague way, was that the brain is important to cognitive functioning. Thoughts and whatnot. So when people were having issues with their mental functioning, doctors, or at least the prehistoric equivalent of doctors, went to the head for solutions. This is where we find our first real treatment for mental illness, trephination. Trephination is a procedure practiced by many cultures over a huge span of time in which a hole is chiseled into the skull of a person suffering from anything ranging from migraines to seizures to full-blown psychosis. The idea was that the hole in the skull would allow for the spirits and demons causing the distress to escape from the mind. Evidence suggests that this was practiced in ancient Mesopotamia all the way through the Middle Ages. Another theory of the origin of mental illness, this one specific to women, was that of what Egyptians around 1900 BCE called the wandering uterus. The Greeks would later come to call this hysteria. I think wandering uterus is the far more accurate title, as the condition consists of a woman's uterus abandoning its post and visiting other parts of the body, causing great distress. The Greeks eventually came to the obvious solution that the uterus must be corralled into its proper place by applying strongly smelling substances to the sufferer's body. Sweet, pleasant scents would attract the mischievous uterus, while foul scents would drive it away. There's another treatment that I've neglected to mention thus far, but it's not just the first treatment, but one that is still practiced today: prayer. Especially in ancient times, mental illness was blamed on the sins and wickedness of the afflicted, and it was believed that through punishment and repentance, the illness would go away. Anyways, back to those Greeks we were just talking about. Later on, in around 400 BCE, Hippocrates had an innovative idea. He suggested that the body contained what he called the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, and that the balance of these four humors in the body is what determined a person's mental health. Working with this theory, his solution was to add and remove these substances from the body by any means necessary. It gets pretty gross pretty fast. Anyways, let's fast forward now through a couple thousand years of beating, blaming, cutting, burning, abusing, and abandoning the mentally ill. It'll surely get better after that, right? Wrong. Part 2. Less old stuff. Moving on, we have mental institutions, or as they were called in less charitable times, insane asylums. While there are some here and there before, these places became prevalent in the 1600s. Mental institutions at this time were much less about the treatment of mental illness and much more about containing the mentally ill. You see, mental illness was still extremely stigmatized, and it was shameful and difficult to have mentally ill people around in general society. So they were locked up in unimaginably horrible conditions. They would be chained up, underclothed, underfed, left without care for days, even weeks at a time. Further, in many cases, they would even be punished, with the remaining belief that these illnesses were of their own making, and that with ample beatings, their sins would be repaid and their affliction would resolve itself. What's truly tragic is that these people didn't just suffer through this terrible treatment, but that they were the specific people in the most need of patience, care, and understanding. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, two notable figures realized this tragedy and took some steps to rectify it. In France, there was Philippe Pinel, and in England, there was William Tuke. They began what came to be known as the humanitarian or moral treatment movement. Basically, they treated the mentally ill like human beings instead of pesky animals. They provided clean, peaceful accommodations where patients could feel safe and relaxed. And what do you know? people got better. But it turns out that treating people this well is difficult and expensive, so the movement didn't really stick. Another important figure is Dorothy Dix. She worked for decades around this time to establish facilities in what was called the mental hygiene movement. This was similar to the moral treatment movement in that it treated patients humanely, but it pretty much exclusively attended to their physical needs, rendering them physically healthy, but often still mentally unwell. As an aside, this isn't all that important, as it's just another treatment that is essentially abusing the mentally ill for no good reason. But it's important to me that I tell you about it. In the mid-1700s, mental hospitals used a device called a gyrator, or gyrating chair. Basically, they strapped a patient down and shook them violently until they passed out. There's no evidence whatsoever of this ever helping. At around the same time as all of these institutions were being made, Franz Anton Mesmer came into prominence with his practice of mesmerism. Basically, he believed that there are magnetic fluids in the human body that are affected by the movement of the planets, and that by balancing them, mental illnesses could be cured. Further, he believed that he had personally mastered his magnetic fluids to the point that he could utilize his own body's animal magnetism to cure patients. Like, this man literally waved a wand over patients and told them their illness was cured. Let's move out of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. While mesmerism was, let's say, questionable, it did lay some of the foundations for the work of everyone's favorite creep, the unofficial mascot of the entire field of psychology, Sigmund Freud. I'm not going to go into much of what Freud said. Lots of weird sex stuff, something about a cigar, he might have had a thing for his mom. Whatever, go read a book about him. The most important development here is Freud's discovery that just talking to a patient suffering with mental illness, if done correctly, can alleviate or even cure the illness. He called his process psychoanalysis, and it would eventually lead others to develop the various systems of talk therapy we see today. The early 1900s also brought along the development of some new physical procedures. Insulin shock therapy, the precursor to electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, used an injection to cause a patient to violently convulse, afterwards having some relief from some forms of extreme mental distress. The process was inhumane and often used as abuse to punish patients at mental hospitals. The ECT that is still practiced today operates on some of the same top-level principles, but is much different in practice and causes no severe trauma to the patient. The other notable procedure of the time is the lobotomy, in which a tool similar to an ice pick is jammed through the patient's eye socket and into the brain. This procedure made difficult patients easier to deal with, but at the price of severely damaged cognitive and emotional functioning. This procedure was deemed inhumane and unproductive and is no longer widely used today. Part 3. Current stuff and beyond. Since around the 1950s, long-term inpatient mental health facilities have been on a downward trend. This move away from them is known as the deinstitutionalization movement, and it was meant to give patients a more humane, free existence. While this was the case for many who were able to get treatment while living on their own, there is a significant population of people who would still benefit from long-term care who have now been forced onto the streets without the ability to improve their situation. There are still facilities that house people today, but they are usually more focused short-term programs aiming to give patients the tools and abilities they need to be successful in their normal daily lives. Modern treatment in general is much harder to describe with generalizations, as the field has exploded with research over the last few decades. For starters, the diagnosis of mental illness is more complicated and specific than ever, due in no small part to the decades-long development of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The current edition of the manual was published in 2013 and is called the DSM-5. Treatment is equivalently broad, so I won't be able to list everything, but it typically consists of some mix of talk therapy and mental health medication. Medication is something I didn't discuss much thus far. It started to be used in about the 1950s and continues today. Unfortunately, psychiatry is much too complicated for me to cover in much detail, but new medications and variations on old medications are being studied and discovered every day. When these methods fail, there are more intensive techniques such as ECT and TMS, which directly stimulate the brain. And again, with these types of treatment, more and more is being discovered every day. Basically, there's never been a better time to be mentally ill. Treatment progresses every day, and the stigma's going away too. If you're struggling with mental illness, please know that you're not alone, and care is readily available. Hang in there, it really does get better. Anyways, I've got to go now. Lots of science to be done. Bye-bye.